December 16th, 1944, 05:45 hours. Losheimergraben, Belgium. The first artillery shells exploded just as Sergeant William Tsakanikas reached for his radio handset. The 394th Infantry Regiment's forward positions erupted in fire and steel as 2,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Through the chaos, through the screaming wounded and collapsing bunkers, through the roar of incoming shells that made thought nearly impossible, Tsakanikas' voice crackled across the SCR 300 radio with crystalline clarity. "This is Fox Company. We're under massive artillery attack. Estimate battalion strength German infantry forming for assault. Request immediate artillery support. Coordinates." 8 miles behind the lines, the Fire Direction Center received every word. Within 3 minutes, American 105mm howitzers were answering. The radio transmission that saved Fox Company that morning represented technology the Germans didn't possess and couldn't counter. While German units struggled with radios that turned to static under artillery fire, while their officers shouted into useless handsets trying to coordinate defenses, American forces maintained perfect communication through the heaviest bombardment of the Western Front. The invisible network of frequency-modulated radio waves connecting every American unit would prove more decisive than armor, more powerful than artillery, more devastating to German hopes than any weapon the Third Reich had imagined facing. What German intelligence didn't know, as their forces surged west, was that they were attacking into a communications network so sophisticated, so ubiquitous, so reliable under combat conditions that it would turn every German tactical victory into a strategic disaster. Every German penetration would be reported instantly. Every gap in American lines would be identified and sealed. Every counterattack would be coordinated across divisions in minutes rather than hours. The Americans had created something unprecedented in military history. A real-time battlefield command and control system that functioned perfectly under the worst conditions imaginable. And the Germans, still relying on telephone lines that artillery cut and radios that barely worked in good weather, were about to discover that in modern warfare, the side that can talk wins. The German plan for Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, was brilliant in conception and doomed by a fundamental miscalculation. General Alfred Jodl had calculated that American forces spread thin across the quiet Ardennes sector would collapse when hit by overwhelming force. Telephone lines would be cut by artillery. Radio communications would be disrupted by jamming and by the sheer chaos of battle. American units would fight as isolated battalions, unable to coordinate, unable to call for help, unable to know where their neighbors were or where the Germans were coming from. This had worked in Poland in 1939. It had worked in France in 1940. German doctrine assumed it would work again. What Jodl didn't know was that by December 1944, every American rifle company had an SCR 300 radio. Every battalion had multiple SCR 694s. Every regiment possessed SCR 193 sets that could communicate across 50 miles. Every division had radio nets that connected infantry, artillery, armor, and air support into a seamless web. And every single one of these radios used frequency modulation technology that German engineers hadn't mastered, operating on frequencies German jammers couldn't reach, with reliability under combat conditions that German equipment couldn't approach. The Americans weren't just better equipped. They were fighting with technology from a different era. The SCR 300, the backpack radio that would save countless American lives during the Battle of the Bulge, represented 10 years of American engineering innovation that the Germans had never matched. Motorola engineers had created a masterpiece of reliability. 40 pounds of precision electronics that could be dropped from trucks, dragged through mud, frozen solid, thawed, and dropped again, and still transmit perfectly. The Germans had nothing remotely comparable. Their infantry radios, when they had them at all, weighed twice as much, transmitted half as far, and broke down constantly. More importantly, they used amplitude modulation that turned to static in bad weather, near electrical equipment or under artillery fire. The SCR-300's frequency modulation cut through all of it. First Lieutenant Paul Bulge, commanding F Company, 2nd Battalion, 413th Infantry Regiment, experienced the difference firsthand in the opening hours of the German assault. His position at Echternach came under attack from elements of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division. German infantry, supported by assault guns, hit his company from 3 directions simultaneously. Bulge's radio operator, Private Frank Curry, maintained constant communication with battalion headquarters throughout the battle. Artillery fire requests were answered within minutes. Reinforcements were redirected from quiet sectors. Air support arrived when the weather cleared. Every decision battalion made was based on real-time information from Bulge's radio reports. The Germans, advancing through the same artillery fire, lost contact with their regiment within the first hour. Their company commanders shouted orders that subordinate units never received. Their calls for artillery support went unanswered because the radios didn't work through the interference. The contrast in radio technology created an intelligence advantage that multiplied with every hour of battle. By noon on December 16th, American commanders at division, corps, and army level had a comprehensive picture of the German attack. Radio reports from dozens of units flowed up the chain of command, were collated by intelligence officers, and painted an accurate picture of German objectives. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group in Luxembourg City, received detailed reports from 1st Army headquarters just 20 miles from the front. He knew by 1300 hours that this was a major offensive, knew the approximate strength, knew the direction of the main thrusts. The Germans, advancing behind a wall of radio silence, had no comparable intelligence. Their commanders received fragmentary reports from motorcycle couriers and captured the occasional telephone line. They were advancing blind. The German radio equipment itself revealed the technological gap. Hauptmann Friedrich Freiherr von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment dropped behind American lines, discovered this within hours of landing. His battalion possessed exactly 3 working radios, all torn FUD-2S, cumbersome backpack sets that required 2 men to operate. The radios worked perfectly in the Bavarian training grounds where they'd been tested. In the frozen Ardennes, at night, with temperatures below freezing, 2 of the 3 failed completely within the first 6 hours. The third worked intermittently, producing mostly static. Von der Heydte, commanding nearly 1,300 paratroopers on a critical mission to seize crossroads behind American lines, had no communication with German forces for the entire operation. He didn't know where German spearheads were. He didn't know if the offensive was succeeding. He couldn't call for supplies or report American movements. His elite battalion fought and failed in complete isolation because German radio technology couldn't function in winter conditions. The American radio advantage extended beyond infantry communications. The artillery forward observer system, entirely dependent on reliable radios, gave American forces a devastating edge. Every American infantry battalion had artillery forward observers from supporting artillery battalions. These observers carried SCR-610 radios that connected directly to fire direction centers miles behind the lines. When German attacks developed, observers called for fire within seconds. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers, coordinated through radio networks, could mass the fire of entire battalions on targets within minutes. German forces, attacking through terrain they thought provided concealment, found themselves under perfectly coordinated artillery fire that seemed to anticipate their movements. They didn't understand that American observers were reporting their positions in real time, and that fire direction centers were calculating firing solutions while they were still forming for assault. The statistics from the opening days reveal the impact. On December 16th, American artillery units fired approximately 40,000 rounds, almost all directed by radio-equipped forward observers. German artillery, despite having prepared meticulously, fired less efficiently because their forward observers either lacked radios or had radios that didn't work. German infantry advancing behind their barrage often found that supporting artillery couldn't adjust fire because communication had failed. American infantry, even when forced to retreat, maintained continuous contact with artillery support. The result was predictable. German casualties from American artillery significantly exceeded American casualties from German artillery, despite the Germans having numerical superiority in guns. By December 17th, the American communication advantage had created a situation that baffled German commanders. They were advancing, capturing ground, forcing American units to retreat, yet they felt increasingly blind and isolated. Oberst Otto Skorzeny, commanding the 150th Panzer Brigade in its mission to capture bridges behind American lines, discovered that his specially trained troops, dressed in American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles, couldn't function effectively because they lacked the radios that made American units so coordinated. Skorzeny's men could fake the appearance of American soldiers. They couldn't fake the constant radio communication that characterized American operations. Within 24 hours, the deception operation had failed completely. Betrayed partly by the absence of the very radio communication German intelligence had dismissed as unnecessary American excess. The SCR-508 radio system in American tanks created another layer of superiority that German forces never overcame. Every Sherman tank possessed a complete radio suite capable of communicating with other tanks, with infantry, with artillery, and with air support. German commanders observing American armored operations reported something they found incomprehensible. American tank platoons, separated by terrain, unable to see each other, moved with perfect coordination. They appeared to know instinctively where friendly forces were, where Germans were, where to maneuver. The secret wasn't instinct. It was the constant stream of radio communication between tanks, between tank commanders and infantry, between tank units and headquarters. German tanks, many of which lacked radios entirely, operated like blind men stumbling through a battlefield where their opponents could see everything. Colonel Remer, commanding the Führer Begleit Brigade, experienced this disparity personally during the fighting around Bastogne. His elite unit, equipped with Panthers and Tigers, represented some of the best remaining German armor. On December 22nd, his tanks engaged elements of the American 4th Armored Division, advancing to relieve Bastogne. The tactical situation initially favored the Germans. Superior guns, better armor, excellent defensive positions. Within minutes, the American advantage in communications turned the battle. American tank commanders reported German positions to artillery observers. American infantry pinpointed German tanks for supporting tank destroyers. American P-47s, directed by ground controllers with crystal-clear radio communication, attacked German armor with devastating accuracy. Remer's force, unable to coordinate effectively because their radios barely worked in winter conditions, suffered catastrophic losses. Panthers that should have dominated the battlefield burned because American forces coordinated fire from multiple sources through perfect radio communication. The German 6th SS Panzer Army, the main thrust of the offensive, discovered another critical weakness in their radio communications during the assault on Elsenborn Ridge. Sepp Dietrich commanded what should have been an unstoppable force. 640 tanks and assault guns, 4 SS Panzer divisions, overwhelming firepower. They ran directly into the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, which used radio communications to create a defense that shouldn't have been possible. American battalions under attack called for artillery support from divisions across the entire sector. Forward observers directed fire from artillery units they'd never met, coordinating through radio nets that connected dozens of batteries. The result was the most intensive artillery defense of the war. German attacks ran into curtains of fire that appeared instantly and never slackened. Dietrich reported to headquarters that American artillery fire was supernatural in its accuracy and volume. The supernatural element was radio communication that worked perfectly under combat conditions. By December 19th, German commanders were reporting a phenomenon they couldn't explain. American forces were retreating in good order, maintaining cohesion, coordinating movements across entire divisions. Units that should have been surrounded and destroyed slipped away and reappeared on German flanks. Forces that should have been isolated coordinated massive counterattacks. Intelligence officers attributed this to superior American training or to inexplicable good luck. The real explanation was simpler and more devastating. Every American unit maintained radio contact throughout retreats. Company commanders knew where their flanking units were. Battalion commanders coordinated movements with neighboring battalions. Regimental commanders maintained contact with division headquarters. The Americans weren't lucky. They were connected. They fought as an integrated whole, while Germans fought as isolated battalions. The most dramatic demonstration of American radio superiority came at Bastogne, when the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division found themselves surrounded. German commanders expected a quick victory. Surrounded forces, cut off from supply and communication, had historically surrendered after brief resistance. The siege of Bastogne would prove that radio communication had changed the rules. Despite being surrounded, despite having no ground line of communication, despite facing the full force of multiple German divisions, Bastogne never lost contact with higher headquarters. SCR 193 radios maintained communication with 8th Corps headquarters. Artillery forward observers with SCR 610S coordinated defensive fire from artillery units outside the encirclement. Tank radios maintained tactical coordination. The surrounded forces fought with better communication than the besieging Germans possessed. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to the German surrender demand was transmitted by radio to Courtney Hodges at 1st Army headquarters within an hour. The reply became instant legend, partly because American radio communication allowed it to spread through military channels almost immediately. More importantly, the radios allowed McAuliffe to coordinate a defense that made the German siege irrelevant. When German attacks developed, artillery observers called for fire from guns miles outside the perimeter. When supplies ran low, air supply operations were coordinated through radio links. When Patton's Third Army prepared to relieve the siege, coordination occurred through radio networks that the Germans never detected and couldn't have disrupted even if they'd known about them. The relief of Bastogne demonstrated combined arms coordination that German commanders found utterly mystifying. On December 26th, elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through German lines and reached the surrounded garrison. The operation required perfect timing between attacking armor, supporting infantry, coordinating artillery, and defending forces inside Bastogne. Every element was synchronized through radio communication. Tank commanders talked directly to McAuliffe's staff. Artillery forward observers with Patton's forces coordinated with artillery inside Bastogne to create perfectly timed fire support. Fighter bombers, directed by ground controllers communicating via radio, with both attacking and defending forces, struck German positions with devastating accuracy. The Germans, fighting the same battle with telephone lines cut and radios that barely functioned, could neither coordinate effective defense nor understand how the Americans achieved such precise coordination. German after-action reports from the Bastogne operation reveal growing panic about American radio capabilities. A captured intelligence summary from the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division noted, "Enemy maintains continuous radio contact at all levels despite artillery fire, despite jamming attempts, despite weather conditions that ground our aircraft and disable our radios. Their ability to coordinate across multiple units simultaneously suggests technological superiority we cannot match with current equipment. Another report from the 2nd Panzer Division stated more bluntly, American forces possess communication capabilities that make traditional tactics obsolete. They respond to our movements faster than motorcycle couriers could carry messages. They coordinate artillery from multiple battalions faster than our fire direction centers can calculate firing solutions. Their air support arrives with accuracy suggesting ground controllers can guide aircraft directly to targets. We are not fighting an equivalent force. We are fighting forces that can see and respond where we are blind and slow. The Malmedy massacre, one of the war's most notorious war crimes, occurred partly because German forces lacked the radio communication to process prisoners properly. When Kampfgruppe Peiper encountered over 100 American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, Joachim Peiper faced a dilemma. His spearhead was moving fast, trying to reach the Meuse River before American reinforcements arrived. He had no way to radio rear units to pick up prisoners. He had no way to coordinate with higher headquarters about prisoner processing. German military police companies that should have handled prisoners were miles behind, unreachable by radio. The SS troops, operating in the same communication void that affected all German units, simply murdered the prisoners rather than deal with them. The massacre shocked the world. It also revealed the practical consequences of fighting without adequate radio communication. American forces, facing similar situations, simply radioed for military police units to pick up prisoners, a solution unavailable to Germans whose radios didn't work reliably enough for routine coordination. As the offensive stalled in late December, German commanders began to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood American capabilities. Field Marshal Model's situation reports to OKW grew increasingly desperate. On December 24th, he reported, "The enemy's ability to shift forces and coordinate counterattacks exceeds any capability we have faced. They appear to possess instant communication across their entire front. Our attacks succeed locally, but are immediately countered by forces arriving from sectors we believed quiet. Their artillery response time is impossibly fast. Their air support operates with ground coordination we cannot explain." Model, one of Germany's most capable field commanders, had begun to grasp that he was fighting an enemy operating with fundamentally superior technology. He didn't fully understand the role of radio communication, but he recognized that Americans possessed capabilities German forces couldn't match. The German intelligence failure regarding American radio capabilities stemmed partly from Nazi racial ideology and partly from systematic underestimation of American industrial capacity. German technical intelligence knew about frequency modulation radio. German engineers had examined captured American radios and correctly assessed their superiority. But German planning officers and field commanders had dismissed these reports. American industrial success couldn't be real because Americans were racially inferior. American radio superiority couldn't be decisive because superior German soldiers would overcome equipment advantages through fighting spirit and tactical skill. These assumptions, comfortable lies wrapped in ideology, meant that Germany went into the Ardennes offensive blind to one of the key American advantages. They planned an operation that required cutting enemy communications without understanding that American communications couldn't be cut because they didn't depend on telephone wires, but on radio waves the Germans couldn't jam and couldn't intercept effectively. By December 26th, the high water mark of the German offensive, American radio communication had created a battlefield situation that was strategically hopeless for Germany regardless of tactical outcomes. Every German unit was located and tracked. Every movement was reported immediately. Every attack was met with coordinated response. American commanders at all levels possessed an accurate picture of the entire battlefield, updated continuously through radio reports. German commanders operated with fragmentary information hours out of date. The contrast was stark. General Eisenhower, at Chef headquarters in Versailles, received real-time reports from the battlefield. Adolf Hitler, in his bunker at Adlerhorst, received optimistic summaries edited by staff officers afraid to report reality. The side with better communication not only fought better, but thought better, planned better, reacted better. The American counter-offensive that would crush the German salient began with perfect radio coordination. Patton's famous pivot north, moving 3 divisions from offensive operations against the Siegfried Line to counter-attack positions in the Ardennes, required coordination across hundreds of units. The operation was planned in hours and executed in days, a feat German commanders considered impossible. Patton's staff coordinated entirely through radio communication. Division commanders received orders via radio. Artillery units coordinated movements via radio. Supply convoys were directed via radio. Air support was arranged via radio. The Germans, observing American forces disappearing from their front and reappearing on their flank, had no explanation. Their intelligence officers suggested American commanders possessed superhuman prescience. The truth was simpler. American forces could coordinate complex operations quickly because their radio communication allowed instant transmission of orders and instant feedback about execution. Part 2/2. The air support coordination during the Battle of the Bulge provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of American radio superiority. When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, unleashing Allied air power, the coordination was seamless and deadly. Ground controllers equipped with SCR-522 radios talked directly to P-47 pilots overhead. Target information flowed from infantry units under attack to ground controllers to aircraft in seconds. Bomb strikes hit German columns within minutes of infantry reports. Fighter bombers circled battlefields like hawks, waiting for radio calls from ground forces, then striking with surgical precision. German forces experienced something they'd never encountered before: air attacks that arrived instantly in response to ground movements, guided by controllers who could see through the fog of war because radios gave them eyes everywhere. The Germans had attempted similar coordination in earlier campaigns, but never achieved American efficiency because their radios couldn't provide reliable ground-to-air communication. Luftwaffe ground controllers struggled with equipment that worked poorly under combat conditions. Luftwaffe pilots often couldn't hear ground controllers at all or received garbled messages. The result was that German air support, when available, arrived late and attacked wrong targets. American air support, guided by perfect radio communication, struck with accuracy that seemed supernatural to Germans, huddling in burned vehicles, wondering how the Americans always knew exactly where they were. By January 1st, 1945, the statistical reality of the Battle of the Bulge had become inescapable. German forces had penetrated 50 miles into American lines, created a salient that threatened the liberation of France, and achieved complete tactical surprise. Yet they had failed catastrophically. They had failed not because American soldiers fought better, though they fought superbly, and not because American equipment was superior, though it often was. They had failed because American forces could coordinate and Germans couldn't. Every local German victory became strategic defeat because Americans instantly knew about it and responded. Every breakthrough was contained because defending forces called for help and help arrived, coordinated through radio networks that functioned perfectly under the worst conditions imaginable. The human cost of German radio inferiority became apparent in casualty statistics. German losses in the Ardennes exceeded 100,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. Many of these casualties occurred because units couldn't communicate effectively. Infantry attacks continued long after they should have been called off because orders to retreat never arrived. Artillery barrages hit German positions because forward observers couldn't inform fire direction centers about friendly locations. German soldiers died waiting for support that never came because the radios that should have summoned it didn't work. The Wehrmacht, still one of the world's best fighting forces on a tactical level, was being bled white by the invisible disadvantage of communication poverty. American casualties, though significant at approximately 75,000, were mitigated by radio communication that saved lives. Surrounded units called for artillery support that extracted them. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly because medical units could be contacted immediately. Units in danger received warnings from neighbors. The SCR-300 radio that many American soldiers cursed as heavy and awkward proved to be a life-saving device. Countless soldiers survived the Battle of the Bulge because their radio operator could call for help, could warn about enemy movements, could coordinate with supporting units. The difference between German communication poverty and American communication abundance was measured not just in battles won, but in lives saved. By mid-January 1945, as American forces eliminated the Bulge and pushed Germans back to their starting positions, German commanders began writing after-action reports that revealed the depth of their communication failure. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, wrote candidly, "The American ability to coordinate exceeded anything in our experience. They appear to possess instant communication that allows them to concentrate forces and firepower faster than we can react. Our own communication systems, adequate for defensive operations, proved entirely inadequate for the fluid offensive warfare we attempted. Telephone lines were cut immediately. Radio communication failed in winter conditions and under artillery fire. We fought blind while the enemy possessed perfect awareness." General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was more blunt in his assessment. American radio superiority was decisive. They talked to each other constantly. They coordinated across divisions as easily as we coordinated within companies. Their artillery response was impossibly fast because forward observers could call for fire instantly. Their air support operated with ground coordination we never achieved with the Luftwaffe. Most devastatingly, they adapted continuously because communication allowed them to understand the battlefield in real time, while we operated with information hours old and often completely wrong. These reports, filed up through Wehrmacht channels, were largely ignored by Hitler and OKW staff. Admitting that superior technology had defeated superior German soldiers contradicted Nazi ideology. Easier to blame weather, bad luck, individual commanders' failures than to confront the reality that Germany was fighting with obsolete communications against an enemy that had revolutionized warfare through radio technology. The technological gap between German and American radio equipment was well known to German signals intelligence officers who had studied captured equipment. Technical reports from 1943 and 1944 had warned that American frequency modulation radios were superior in every measurable way: range, clarity, reliability, ease of use, weather resistance, all favored the Americans dramatically. German engineers had attempted to copy American designs, but lacked the sophisticated manufacturing capability to produce equivalent equipment at scale. Germany could make small numbers of excellent radios in laboratory conditions. America could mass-produce millions of sophisticated radios that worked perfectly in the hands of minimally trained soldiers under the worst possible conditions. The difference between excellence in design and excellence in manufacturing proved decisive. The Battle of the Bulge also revealed the American advantage in radio operator training. Every American infantry company had radio operators who received extensive training in communications procedures, radio repair, and tactical employment. These soldiers weren't specialists isolated from combat. They were integral parts of infantry units who understood how to use communications to support combat operations. German radio operators, when units had them, were often poorly trained and isolated from tactical operations. German officers frequently didn't understand radio capabilities and limitations, leading to misuse or underuse of available equipment. American officers, by contrast, were taught from basic training that radio communication was essential to modern warfare. The cultural difference in how the two armies viewed communications proved as important as the technological differences in equipment. The impact of radio superiority extended beyond the Battle of the Bulge itself. The lessons learned in the Ardennes influenced American military doctrine permanently. The U.S. Army realized that radio communication had become as essential as rifles and ammunition. Post-war force structure ensured that every unit down to platoon level would have organic radio communication. Training emphasized communications from the earliest days of boot camp. Equipment development focused on making radios lighter, more reliable, more powerful. The German lesson that an army without reliable communications is an army fighting blind became foundational to American military thinking. For Germany, the communication failure in the Ardennes was symptomatic of larger systemic problems. The Wehrmacht could no longer compete technologically with American forces. Production of sophisticated equipment like radios required industrial capacity Germany no longer possessed. Training of radio operators required time and resources Germany couldn't spare. Most fundamentally, the Nazi system's emphasis on ideological purity over technical competence meant that Germany couldn't adapt to American advantages. When technical officers reported that American communications were superior, they were ignored or accused of defeatism. The truth was uncomfortable, so it was suppressed. The Wehrmacht went into its final battles of the war, knowing it faced enemies with superior communications, but unable to do anything about it because the system wouldn't acknowledge the problem. The final irony of German communication failure in the Battle of the Bulge was that Germany had pioneered military radio communications in the 1920s and 1930s. Heinz Guderian had built the panzer forces around the principle that armored warfare required radio communication to coordinate fast-moving operations. The Wehrmacht of 1940 had possessed superior communications to its opponents, contributing significantly to its stunning victories. But Germany had stagnated while America innovated. German radios in 1944 were incrementally improved versions of 1930s designs. American radios in 1944 incorporated a decade of technological advancement, particularly in frequency modulation, that German industry couldn't replicate. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the teacher never recovered. Individual German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge and were captured by American forces consistently expressed amazement at American radio capabilities. Interrogation reports from January and February 1945 contain repeated references to prisoners asking about American radios. How did they work in bad weather? How could infantry companies afford such expensive equipment? How did Americans train so many radio operators? The questions revealed genuine bewilderment. German soldiers had been taught that German technology was superior. The radios they observed Americans using casually, distributing to every company, using constantly without apparent concern about cost or complexity, contradicted everything they'd been told about American industrial backwardness. Some German prisoners became fixated on American radios as symbols of the wider industrial gap. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured near Bastogne on December 30th, told interrogators, "Your radios represent everything about this war. You have equipment that works in conditions where ours fails. You have so many that every squad seems to have one. You use them casually, like they cost nothing. Our officers told us American equipment was inferior, that Americans were soft and couldn't fight. But men with equipment like these radios, men who can talk to artillery and airplanes and tanks all at once, these are not soft. These are men who will win, because they have made war into science, while we still fight with courage and hope." The post-war analysis of the Battle of the Bulge by American military historians uniformly emphasized the decisive role of communications. The U.S. Army's official history noted that American ability to concentrate forces, coordinate counterattacks, and maintain cohesion during retreats depended fundamentally on radio communication that functioned reliably under combat conditions. German forces, lacking equivalent communications, fought increasingly isolated tactical battles that could not achieve strategic objectives regardless of local successes. Academic historians reached similar conclusions. The Battle of the Bulge represented the maturation of American combined arms doctrine, and that doctrine was entirely dependent on radio communication that linked infantry, artillery, armor, and air support into a seamless system. German military analysts examining the battle after the war were equally clear about the importance of communications. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served on the Eastern Front during the Bulge but later analyzed the battle extensively, wrote, "The American advantage in communications was perhaps their most decisive asset. German forces, even when superior in numbers and equipment, could not coordinate effectively. American forces, even when retreating and outnumbered, maintained coordination that allowed them to concentrate forces and firepower at critical points. This was not a matter of fighting spirit or tactical skill. It was a matter of technology that allowed instant communication across entire fronts. The SCR-300 radio, the backpack set that became iconic of American infantry communications, was produced in astonishing quantities during the war. Over 50,000 units were manufactured, enough to equip every American rifle company multiple times over. The production statistics themselves revealed the American approach to technology. Rather than making a few excellent radios for elite units, America mass-produced reliable radios for everyone. Rather than treating radio communication as a specialty for signals units, America distributed radios throughout the force. The democracy of technology, making sophisticated equipment available to ordinary soldiers, proved more effective than the German approach of reserving technology for elite units. The contrast was stark in the Ardennes. American infantry companies with SCR-300s could call for artillery support, could coordinate with neighboring units, could report enemy movements, all through radio communication operated by trained soldiers who were primarily infantrymen, not specialists. German infantry companies, if they had radios at all, had equipment that often didn't work, and operators who were specialists disconnected from tactical operations. American radios were tools used by fighters. German radios were specialist equipment maintained by non-fighters. The difference in philosophy translated directly to battlefield effectiveness. The FM radio technology that made American communications so superior was itself a story of American innovation. Edwin Armstrong had invented frequency modulation in the 1930s. American corporations like Motorola had refined it for military use. American manufacturers had learned to produce FM radios at scale. The technology wasn't secret. German engineers knew about it. But Germany lacked the industrial capacity and technological sophistication to replicate it. Germany could design excellent radios. Germany couldn't manufacture them by the tens of thousands with consistent quality. America could, and did. The invisible advantage of superior manufacturing, of industrial depth that allowed production of sophisticated equipment at scale, proved as important as any technological breakthrough. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last major German offensive of the war and the last time German forces would fight with any hope of strategic success. The defeat in the Ardennes consumed Germany's final reserves of men and equipment. More importantly, it consumed the last remnants of German strategic initiative. After the Bulge, Germany could only defend, and defense without adequate communications proved futile. American forces, advancing with radio networks that allowed perfect coordination, overwhelmed German defenses systematically. The side that could talk coordinated attacks across entire fronts. The side that couldn't talk fought isolated battles and lost them incrementally. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the communication gap had become unbridgeable. American forces possessed millions of radios. German forces had scraps of equipment that mostly didn't work. American soldiers expected reliable communication as a normal part of military operations. German soldiers had learned to operate without communications, adapting to permanent isolation. The Wehrmacht of May 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that had conquered Europe in 1940. Many factors contributed to this decline, but the loss of communication superiority was among the most significant. An army that can't coordinate is not really an army. It's a collection of isolated units fighting separate battles. By war's end, that description fit the Wehrmacht perfectly. The legacy of American radio superiority in World War II shaped military communications for decades. The principle that every unit needed organic communications became foundational to American military doctrine. The emphasis on reliable, easy-to-use equipment that functioned in all conditions influenced equipment development. The integration of radio operators into combat units, rather than isolating them in signal corps, became standard practice. Most importantly, the understanding that communications was not a support function, but a combat multiplier, as important as firepower itself, shaped how America built and trained its military forces. For soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the memory of radio communication as a life-saving technology remained vivid. Veterans of the battle consistently mentioned their radios when discussing what made victory possible. "We could talk to each other," was a common refrain in oral histories. "We knew where everyone was. We could call for help. The Germans couldn't do any of that." The simplicity of the observation belied its importance. Talking to each other, knowing where everyone was, calling for help. These basic communications functions that American soldiers took for granted determined outcomes of battles and saved countless lives. The German perspective, gleaned from post-war interrogations and memoirs, revealed frustration and incomprehension. German soldiers had been excellent fighters. German officers had been tactically skilled. German equipment had often been superior. Yet they had lost decisively and comprehensively. Many German veterans fixed on American material superiority as the explanation. They had been overwhelmed by numbers, by industrial production they couldn't match. This was partially true, but it missed the crucial point. American material superiority was most effective because it was coordinated through communications that Germans couldn't match. 10 tanks with radios beat 20 tanks without radios. 10 artillery batteries coordinated by radio beat 20 batteries firing independently. The multiplication of force through coordination, enabled by reliable radio communication, was the true American advantage. Looking back at the Battle of the Bulge from the perspective of military history, the decisive role of radio communications seems obvious. At the time, to soldiers fighting in the snow and commanders planning operations, communications was just one factor among many. But it was the factor that made everything else work. Artillery was devastating because forward observers could call for it instantly. Air support was effective because ground controllers could direct it precisely. Reinforcements arrived at critical points because units could call for help and commanders could respond. Retreats were orderly because units could coordinate movements. Every aspect of American tactical superiority traced back to the ability to communicate reliably under combat conditions. The Battle of the Bulge also demonstrated the vulnerability of military forces dependent on telephone communications. German forces had built their communication system around telephone networks. These worked well in defensive positions where lines could be buried and protected. They failed catastrophically in offensive operations, where lines were constantly cut by artillery fire and by the movement of forces. The Germans never made the transition to radio-dependent communications that the Americans had completed by 1944. This organizational failure, rooted in conservative military thinking and industrial incapacity, meant that German forces fought the final year of the war, with communications appropriate to 1918, not 1944. The statistical summary of radio equipment in the Battle of the Bulge tells the story starkly. American forces engaged in the battle possessed approximately 2,000 SCR-300 radios, 600 SCR-193 radios, thousands of SCR-610 artillery radios, and complete radio sets in every tank and vehicle. German forces possessed perhaps 200 functional infantry radios total, almost no artillery radios, and radio equipment in fewer than 20% of armored vehicles. The ratio wasn't 2-to-1 or even 5-to-1. It was closer to 20-to-1 or 30-to-1 in functional radios per unit. And American radios worked reliably, while German radios often didn't. The communication advantage was overwhelming. The final assessment of the Battle of the Bulge must acknowledge that multiple factors contributed to German defeat. American air superiority, once weather cleared, was devastating. American artillery superiority in numbers and effectiveness was significant. American advantages in fuel and logistics were critical. German intelligence failures and Hitler's strategic delusions contributed substantially. But underlying all of these factors, enabling American advantages and magnifying German weaknesses, was the invisible network of radio communications that allowed American forces to coordinate while German forces operated blind. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, the future of warfare became visible to those who could see it. Radio communication had transformed military operations fundamentally. The side with superior communications would win, regardless of other factors, assuming rough parity in equipment and soldiers. The Americans had learned this lesson and built their entire military system around it. The Germans, clinging to outdated doctrines and lacking industrial capacity to adopt new technology, had failed to adapt. The result was predictable and devastating. German soldiers, many of them excellent fighters, died because they couldn't call for help. German officers, often tactically brilliant, lost battles because they couldn't coordinate forces. German units, frequently superior in equipment, were defeated because they fought alone while Americans fought together. The radio operators, who maintained communications during the Battle of the Bulge, often unheralded and forgotten, were as essential to victory as the infantry who held the line or the tankers who counterattacked. Private Frank Curry, who maintained radio contact throughout the desperate defense at Echternach, saved his company through communications that brought artillery support when ammunition ran low. Sergeant William Tsakanikas, whose radio call started the first American defensive response on December 16th, demonstrated the life-saving importance of reliable communications. Thousands of other radio operators, their names lost to history, kept American forces connected when connection meant survival. The German experience in the Battle of the Bulge, fighting without reliable communications against an enemy that possessed perfect communications, was a preview of what would become standard in modern warfare. By the 21st century, communication networks would be even more critical than firepower. The side that could coordinate would dominate. The side that lost communications capability would lose battles regardless of other advantages. The Americans, in 1944, had figured this out through a combination of technological innovation and tactical experience. The Germans never did, and paid for that failure with complete defeat. For the German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge and witnessed American radio capabilities firsthand, the experience was sobering. They had been told they were fighting inferior enemies with inferior technology. Instead, they discovered they were the ones with inferior technology, fighting enemies who possessed capabilities their commanders had dismissed as impossible. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Nazi ideology had promised German technological superiority. Reality delivered German obsolescence. The radios that every American squad seemed to possess, that worked in conditions where German radios failed, that coordinated forces with precision German commanders couldn't match. These radios told a story about industrial capacity and technological sophistication that contradicted every assumption German soldiers had been taught. The Battle of the Bulge ended in complete German defeat. By late January 1945, American forces had eliminated the Bulge and pushed German forces back to their starting positions. German losses exceeded 100,000 men and 800 armored vehicles. American losses, though significant, were sustainable and quickly replaced. More importantly, American forces emerged from the battle with their communication systems intact and improved. Lessons learned in the Ardennes led to refinements in radio procedures, improvements in equipment distribution, and enhanced training for radio operators. The Germans emerged with no lessons that could be applied because they lacked the industrial capacity to produce the radios that would have allowed them to compete. The story of radio superiority in the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about the decisive importance of communication in modern warfare. The side that can talk wins. The side that can coordinate forces across entire fronts dominates the side that fights battalion by battalion. The Americans understood this and built a military system around reliable communications. The Germans never fully grasped it, and even when individual commanders recognized the importance of communications, German industry couldn't provide the equipment needed. The result was inevitable. American forces fought as an integrated whole, coordinating artillery, air support, armor, and infantry through radio networks that functioned perfectly. German forces fought as isolated units, unable to coordinate, unable to call for help, unable to adapt to American movements. The side with radios buried the side without radios under an avalanche of coordinated firepower. Standing in the frozen forests where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, it's possible to imagine the radio signals that once filled the air. Invisible, unhearable to human ears, these electromagnetic waves carried the orders and information that determined who would live and die, who would advance and retreat, who would win and lose. The German soldiers, fighting in those forests, never heard these signals. They didn't know their enemies possessed communication capabilities that made German equipment seem primitive. They fought bravely and died, not knowing that their real enemy wasn't the American soldiers they could see but the invisible network of communications they couldn't hear. A network that made American forces coordinated and deadly while German forces remained isolated and vulnerable. The radio operators who maintained these communications, sitting in foxholes in sub-zero temperatures, calling in artillery coordinates while being shelled, maintaining contact while retreating under fire, they were the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. Without them, the heroic stands would have been overrun. The counterattacks would have failed. The defense would have collapsed. With them, American forces fought smarter and more effectively than any force in military history to that point. They transformed radio communication from a nice-to-have luxury into an essential weapon that proved as deadly as any gun. The German defeat in the Ardennes, viewed through the lens of communications technology, becomes a cautionary tale about the importance of adapting to technological change. Germany had pioneered military radio communications, had understood earlier than most nations that modern warfare required instant communication. But Germany had failed to keep pace with technological development, had failed to invest in mass production of sophisticated equipment, had failed to distribute radios throughout the force. The result was that by 1944, the student had far surpassed the teacher. American forces possessed communications capabilities that German engineers knew were possible, but German industry couldn't produce. The gap between knowing what was possible and being able to produce it at scale was the gap between Germany's military power in 1940 and its defeat in 1945. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a monument to many things. American resilience, the heroism of soldiers who held impossible positions, the leadership of commanders who turned near defeat into victory, the industrial might that provided equipment and supplies that kept forces fighting. But above all, it stands as a demonstration of what reliable communications can achieve in warfare. The radios that connected American forces, that allowed instant coordination, that brought artillery and air support to bear with devastating speed. These radios were as important to victory as any weapon. The Germans, fighting without equivalent communications, were defeated before the first shot was fired because they couldn't coordinate while their enemies could. The lesson echoes through military history. In modern warfare, the side that can talk wins. The Battle of the Bulge proved it decisively. The Americans could talk, the Germans couldn't. Everything else followed from that simple fact.